On the morning of June 15, 1904, the largest private residence ever constructed on Long Island's North Shore opened its gates to New York society. Castle Gould, 127 rooms sprawling across limestone and marble, costing $8 million in an era when a skilled worker earned $400 a year, stood as a monument to railroad fortune and Gilded Age excess. Frank J. Gould, son of the infamous robber baron J. Gould, had commissioned a medieval Irish castle to be rebuilt, stone by stone, on American soil. But within 15 years, the family would abandon it. Today, few remember it ever existed. This is the story of America's most ambitious mansion, and why its builders wanted it forgotten. Chapter 1. The Castle. Nobody remembers. Stand at the entrance of Sands Point Preserve on Long Island's Gold Coast today, and you might notice something peculiar. Among the walking trails and nature programs tucked behind overgrown hedges and repurposed into administrative offices sits a genuine medieval Irish castle. Not a replica, not an interpretation. An actual stone fortress, dismantled in County Kilkenny, shipped across the Atlantic in numbered pieces, and reassembled on 200 acres of prime waterfront property. Castle Gould cost more to build than the annual budget of 20 American cities in 1904. It required 800 workers laboring for 4 years. Italian stonemasons carved limestone quarried from Indiana. Irish craftsmen installed stained glass windows that had witnessed centuries of European history. The mansion contained innovations that wouldn't become standard in American homes for another 50 years. A complete electrical system, central heating throughout, an internal telephone network connecting all 127 rooms. Yet ask anyone in the surrounding town of Sands Point about Castle Gould, and you'll likely receive blank stares. The Vanderbilt's estates are tourist destinations. The Roosevelt's Sagamore Hill draws crowds. The Guggenheim Mansion became a museum. But Castle Gould, larger than any of them, more expensive than most combined, has been systematically erased from popular memory. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Frank J. Gould, the man who built this palace, was the youngest son of J. Gould, the most hated man in America. His father had manipulated railroads, destroyed competitors, and caused financial panics that ruined thousands of families. When J. Gould died in 1892, leaving a fortune of $77 million, equivalent to $2.5 billion today, his children inherited not just wealth, but America's deepest contempt. Building Castle Gould was Frank's attempt to transform his family's reputation from robber barons to American nobility. The irony is devastating. In trying to prove his legitimacy, Frank created something so ostentatious, so excessive, that it became another symbol of Gould greed. Within a decade, he would flee to France, never to return. The castle would be sold, resold, and eventually fade from public consciousness. But the building itself still stands, and within its walls lies a story about the real cost of American aristocracy. Not just in dollars, but in the lives of the workers who built it, the servants who maintained it, and the communities that both resented and depended upon it. This is a story about ambition and shame, about medieval fantasies constructed with modern exploitation, about how wealth can buy almost anything except the one thing its owners wanted most: respectability. Castle Gould represents the Gilded Age at its most desperate, when new money tried to purchase old legitimacy and discovered that some stains can never be washed clean. The question isn't why Castle Gould was built. The question is why the family that built it worked so hard to make us forget it ever existed. Chapter 2. The Gould Curse. To understand Castle Gould, you must first understand the burden of being J. Gould's son in 1900. Frank J. Gould was born into wealth that came with a permanent asterisk. His father had accumulated one of America's greatest fortunes through methods that contemporaries described as financial terrorism. Jay Gould had manipulated the Erie Railroad in the 1860s, triggering a stock market panic. He'd attempted to corner the gold market in 1869, causing Black Friday and ruining countless investors. He'd crushed labor unions with private armies. When he died in 1892, the New York Times wrote that few men have been the object of such general detestation. Ministers preached sermons celebrating his death. Political cartoons showed him as a vampire, draining the lifeblood of American workers. Frank was only 8 years old when his father died. He grew up in a Fifth Avenue mansion surrounded by armed guards, necessary protection against the death threats that arrived daily. Other children weren't allowed to play with Gould children. Society families, even other nouveau riche families, refused invitations to Gould events. The family name had become synonymous with greed, corruption, and moral bankruptcy. His older siblings developed different coping strategies. George bought a railroad and tried to prove himself a legitimate businessman. Helen married a French count and fled to Europe permanently. Edwin became a recluse. But Frank, the youngest and perhaps most ambitious, decided to fight back through architecture and lifestyle. He would build his way into respectability. By 1900, Frank had accumulated his own fortune through railroad investments and real estate speculation. At 24, he was worth approximately $15 million personally, independent of his inheritance. He was also engaged to Helen Kelly, daughter of a respectable New York banking family. The Kellys weren't enthusiastic about the match, but Frank's wealth was persuasive. The North Shore of Long Island in 1900 was becoming America's Gold Coast. Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Whitneys were building summer estates to escape Manhattan's heat and showcase their wealth. But these families had something Frank lacked: social acceptance. They descended from old New York families or, like the Vanderbilts, had successfully rehabilitated their reputations through strategic marriages, philanthropy, and time. Frank needed something dramatic, something that would declare the Goulds not just wealthy, but cultured, not just American, but aristocratic, not just business owners, but nobility. In 1902, during a trip to Ireland with his fiancée, Frank discovered his answer. Carriglea Castle, a genuine medieval fortress in County Kilkenny, was being sold by an impoverished Irish lord. The castle dated to the 12th century, with sections rebuilt in the 15th and 17th centuries. It represented centuries of aristocratic lineage, exactly what Frank's money couldn't buy. He purchased the entire castle for $100,000 and made a decision that stunned even his own family. He would dismantle it completely, number every stone, ship it to America, and rebuild it on Long Island. Not as a replica, but as the actual castle, transplanted to American soil. His siblings thought he was insane. His fiancée's family was appalled. But Frank was determined. If European aristocrats could claim legitimacy through ancient castles, then he would simply bring an ancient castle to America. He would become American nobility through historical appropriation. On June 8, 1902, Frank purchased 200 acres on Long Island's highest point, overlooking Long Island Sound. The property included a mile of waterfront and clear views of Connecticut across the water. He paid $500,000 for the land, $15 million in today's dollars, making it the most expensive private land purchase on Long Island to that date. Then he began planning something unprecedented in American architecture. He would create not just a home, but a complete medieval compound. The Irish castle would serve as the main residence. He would add gatehouse, stables, water towers, and service buildings, all designed to match medieval Irish architecture. The entire estate would look as though it had existed in Ireland for centuries and been magically transported to America. The architectural community was both fascinated and horrified. This wasn't a Gothic revival mansion like others being built on the Gold Coast. This was actual medieval transplantation. Frank was attempting to buy history itself. Construction began in March 1903. Frank had exactly 15 months to complete the project before his wedding. He spared no expense and showed no patience. What followed was one of the most intense construction projects in Gilded Age history, and one of the most deliberately forgotten. Chapter 3. Building the Impossible. The dismantling of Carriglea Castle in Ireland began in September 1902. Frank hired a team of 50 Irish stonemasons, craftsmen who had spent their lives working on medieval structures. Their job was to carefully remove each stone, number it according to a complex system, and create detailed drawings showing exactly how the castle fit together. The process took 4 months. Each limestone block was measured, documented, and marked with iron tags. The lead-paned windows, some containing glass from the 15th century, were individually crated. Oak beams from the Great Hall, each one hand-hewn from trees that had been growing when Columbus sailed to America, were carefully removed and wrapped. The spiral staircases, worn smooth by centuries of feet, were photographed from every angle. By January 1903, the castle existed in 4,000 wooden crates stacked at the dock in Cork. The shipping alone cost $75,000, equivalent to $2.3 million today. 3 cargo vessels transported the crates to New York, where they were loaded onto barges and shipped to a temporary dock built specifically for the project at Sands Point. Meanwhile, on Long Island, an army of workers had begun preparing the foundation. The medieval castle had been built on Ireland's rocky terrain without deep foundations. American building codes and engineering principles required something more substantial. Frank's architects, Hunt and Hunt, the firm that had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, designed a modern steel and concrete foundation that would be hidden entirely beneath medieval stonework. The excavation required 200 laborers working 10-hour days, 6 days a week. Most were Italian immigrants who had arrived at Ellis Island within the past year. They were paid $1.75 per day, barely enough to afford food, and shared tenement housing in nearby towns. The foundation alone consumed 3,000 tons of concrete and 400 tons of steel reinforcement. The construction superintendent, Thomas Morrison, kept meticulous records that survive today in the New York Historical Society archives. These records reveal the brutal pace of construction. Frank wanted the castle completed in 15 months, an impossible timeline for a project of this scale. Morrison responded by running 2 complete shifts, day workers from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., night workers from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., illuminated by the largest array of electric work lights ever assembled for a private construction project. The night shift earned an additional 25 cents per day. Many workers volunteered for both shifts, working 16-hour days to maximize their earnings. Morrison's records show frequent accidents, crushed fingers, broken bones, 1 death when a worker fell from scaffolding while working in darkness. The dead worker was an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Ferraro, age 19. His family received $100 compensation, approximately 2 months of his wages. The skilled work required different labor. Frank brought 30 Irish stonemasons from the original dismantling team to America. These men earned $4 per day, more than twice what the Italian laborers received, to ensure the castle was rebuilt exactly as it had stood in Ireland. They worked from the detailed drawings, matching each numbered stone to its original position. But medieval architecture and modern American building codes created constant conflicts. The castle's original walls were solid limestone, 3 feet thick, without internal supports. New York regulations required steel framework for a building this size. The solution was ingenious and deceptive. Workers built a modern steel skeleton, then attached the medieval stones to it as a facing. From the outside, it looked authentically medieval. Behind the walls lurked 20th century engineering. The project also required innovation. Medieval castles lacked plumbing, electrical systems, or central heating. Frank wanted modern conveniences hidden within medieval appearance. This meant carving channels through ancient stones to run copper pipes and electrical conduit. It meant installing a complete basement mechanical system beneath the castle, hidden from view. It meant adding windows that looked medieval from outside, but opened like modern double-hung windows from inside. The heating system alone was an engineering marvel. A basement boiler room, excavated beneath the castle's great hall, contained 3 massive coal-fired boilers that could heat all 127 rooms. A network of copper pipes ran through spaces carved into the medieval walls. The system cost $250,000 to install, more than most Americans would earn in multiple lifetimes. The electrical system was even more complex. Frank insisted on electric lighting throughout, but medieval castles didn't have electrical fixtures. The solution involved custom-designed light fixtures that looked like medieval candle sconces and chandeliers, but contained hidden electric bulbs. The system required 12 miles of copper wiring, all concealed within the walls. Water posed special challenges. The castle sat on Long Island's highest point, 200 feet above sea level. City water pressure couldn't reach that height. Frank had 2 water towers built, disguised as medieval guard towers, each holding 50,000 gallons. Steam pumps in the basement lifted water from wells to the towers, providing constant pressure throughout the mansion. The indoor plumbing was state-of-the-art. The castle contained 23 bathrooms, each with flush toilets, running water, and in some cases, the newest luxury: showers. The master bathroom included a marble bathtub imported from Italy that required 4 men to carry it up the spiral staircase. The drainage system emptied into a treatment system that was advanced for its time, processing sewage before releasing it into Long Island Sound. By April 1904, 15 months after construction began, Castle Gould was complete. The final cost: $8 million, equivalent to approximately $250 million today. This included the land, the castle purchase, shipping, construction, mechanical systems, and landscaping. It represented more money than the total annual budget of the city of Rochester, New York. Frank had achieved his architectural dream. The castle looked authentically medieval from every angle. Visitors would walk through a genuine Irish fortress, complete with great hall, spiral staircases, and limestone walls that had witnessed centuries of history. But hidden within those ancient walls was a completely modern mansion, with every convenience technology could provide. What he hadn't achieved, and what he would never achieve, was the respectability he craved. The castle's opening would prove that some legacies can't be erased by architecture, no matter how impressive. Chapter 4. The Golden Summer Castle. Gould officially opened on June 15, 1904, with a wedding. Frank J. Gould married Helen Kelly in a ceremony that represented everything he'd been building toward: social legitimacy wrapped in medieval grandeur. 300 guests, carefully selected from New York's upper crust, received engraved invitations to witness the Goulds entering society as American aristocracy. The wedding was calculated theater. Guests approached the castle through a gated entrance marked by authentic medieval turrets. A mile-long private drive, lined with imported Irish trees, wound upward to the castle entrance. Uniformed footmen, 32 in total, hired specifically for the event, stood at attention in medieval-style livery. The Great Hall, with its 40-foot cathedral ceiling and stone fireplace large enough to roast an ox, had been decorated with white roses and orchards that cost more than most attendees earned in a year. The ceremony itself took place in the castle's chapel, a small medieval room with stained glass windows that had originally illuminated Irish monks in the 13th century. A bishop from the Episcopal diocese performed the service. The reception filled every public room of the castle, showcasing Frank's triumph. But beneath the celebration, tensions simmered. Many guests came out of curiosity, not respect. They wanted to see what Jay Gould's son had built, to judge whether money could purchase taste. The whispered conversations, preserved in contemporary diaries and letters, revealed the social calculus. Impressive architecture, but still a Gould. Medieval stones, but modern greed. An Irish castle, but American stain. The Vanderbilts sent regrets. The Astors attended but left early. Old New York families, those whose names appeared in the original social register, stayed away entirely. Frank had built his castle, but he hadn't stormed society's gates. Still, for the next 2 years, Castle Gould operated at the peak of Gilded Age excess. The household staff numbered 47 people living in the servants' quarters, a separate wing designed to be invisible to guests. The head butler earned $200 annually, the highest servant salary on Long Island. Under butlers, footmen, chambermaids, kitchen staff, laundresses, and maintenance workers formed a carefully hierarchical system that made the mansion function. The kitchen staff alone required 12 people to operate the castle's 2 kitchens, a main kitchen for family and guest meals, and a servants' kitchen for staff. The main kitchen occupied 2,000 square feet in the basement, equipped with 6 coal-fired ranges, 3 ovens, an ice house that held 4 tons of ice, and separate rooms for butchering, baking, and pastry work. The head chef, imported from France, earned $2,000 annually, more than most American professionals. Daily operations consumed staggering resources. The coal furnaces required 4 tons of coal per week in winter, delivered by horse-drawn wagons. The estate employed 6 full-time gardeners to maintain the formal gardens, lawns, and greenhouse. The stables housed 16 horses and employed 5 grooms. The garage, built in matching medieval style, contained 4 automobiles and required 2 full-time mechanics. The castle's telephone system, one of the first private internal phone networks in America, connected 23 rooms. Guests could call for service without leaving their quarters. The system required a dedicated switchboard operator working 12-hour shifts. The annual operating cost for Castle Gould, approximately $250,000, equivalent to $7.5 million today. This covered salaries, supplies, maintenance, utilities, food, and horses. Frank was spending more each year to operate his castle than most American companies earned in profit. Weekend entertaining followed rigid patterns. Friday arrivals brought guests from Manhattan via private rail car to the Long Island Railroad station, then by carriage to the castle. Saturday featured shooting parties in the morning, luncheon at 2 p.m., activities or rest in the afternoon, formal dinner at 8 p.m., and entertainment in the evening. Sunday morning meant chapel service in the castle's medieval prayer room, followed by a massive midday dinner and afternoon departures. The dinner service alone revealed the operation's scale. A formal dinner for 20 guests required 8 footmen in attendance, with additional staff in the kitchen preparing and plating each course. 7 courses was standard: oysters, soup, fish, entree, roast, salad, and dessert. Each course required fresh linens, new silverware, and different wine glasses. The castle's silverware collection, bearing the Gould family crest, included 240 pieces per table setting type. Helen Gould, now Helen Kelly Gould, attempted to establish herself as a society hostess. She organized charity benefits, garden parties, and cultural evenings featuring opera singers imported from Manhattan. she carefully cultivated relationships with slightly lesser families, those who might accept Gould money in exchange for Gould acceptance. But Frank was increasingly absent. Business kept him in Manhattan during the week. Then business required trips to Chicago, then to San Francisco. The castle that was supposed to anchor his social position became an expensive backdrop for his wife's social campaigns. The servants noticed. Morrison's records, which he continued to maintain as estate manager, note increasing tension. Frank's instructions became curt, demanding. Helen's requirements grew more elaborate, more desperate to impress. The castle that was supposed to represent triumph was becoming a trap. By 1906, Frank was spending more time in France than America. He'd discovered that Europe, surprisingly, didn't care about his father's reputation. In Paris, he was simply a wealthy American. In Monte Carlo, his money bought access to genuine aristocracy. The bitter irony, he'd built an Irish castle in America to become American nobility, then fled to Europe where his American wealth made him exotic rather than tainted. The golden period was ending. The castle would soon face its first crisis, and Frank wouldn't be there to defend it. Chapter 5. The Servants' Castle. The medieval Great Hall where the Goulds entertained was 60 feet long with a 40-foot ceiling. But the real heart of Castle Gould was a warren of rooms most guests never saw. The servants' quarters, kitchens, laundry, mechanical rooms, and service corridors that made the mansion function. These spaces tell the other story of Castle Gould, the one the family never wanted told. The servants' wing occupied the entire north side of the castle's second and third floors, containing 47 small rooms accessed by a separate staircase. The rooms averaged 8 by 10 feet, barely larger than prison cells. 2 narrow windows provided limited light. Each room contained an iron bed, a small dresser, 1 chair, and a chamber pot, despite the castle having modern plumbing. Servants weren't allowed to use the family's 23 bathrooms. They shared 4 communal facilities in the servants' wing. The hierarchy was rigid and revealing. The head butler, Thomas Whitfield, an English immigrant, occupied the largest servants' room, 12 by 14 feet, and had his own small sitting area. The lady's maid, who attended directly to Helen Gould, had the second best room. The scullery maids, who scrubbed pots and floors, slept 4 to a room in the attic, in quarters that were stifling in summer and freezing in winter, despite the castle's modern heating system. The heat didn't extend to the servants' attic. The workday began at 5 a.m. for kitchen staff. The coal stoves had to be lit, water heated, and breakfast prepared for both family and servants. The kitchen maids, all young immigrant women, mostly Irish and Italian, worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week. Their wage, $15 per month plus room and board. This was actually higher than many Long Island estates, a fact management mentioned frequently to discourage complaints. Contemporary accounts from servants at similar estates, preserved in oral histories and letters, reveal the daily reality. One kitchen maid at a nearby Vanderbilt estate described washing dishes for 120 people after a dinner party, standing in water that ruined her shoes, finishing at 2 a.m. only to return at 5 a.m. for breakfast duty. Castle Gould operated identically. The laundry work was particularly brutal. The castle generated mountains of dirty linens, bed sheets changed daily, tablecloths after every meal, towels, staff uniforms, and the family's personal clothing. The laundry room, located in the basement next to the boiler room, operated in perpetual heat and steam. 4 women worked there full-time, washing everything by hand in massive copper tubs, wringing items through mechanical mangles, hanging them to dry, then ironing them with heavy steel irons heated on a stove. The head laundress, Mary Sullivan, an Irish immigrant, worked at Castle Gould for 8 years. A brief interview she gave to a local newspaper in 1911 survives. She described washing 200 sheets weekly, 300 towels, 180 napkins, plus tablecloths, personal linens, and staff uniforms. The work destroyed her hands. Cracked, burned from the hot water and lye soap, arthritic by age 35. The footmen had different challenges. They were required to stand absolutely still during meals, ready to serve but invisible unless needed. Dinner service could last 3 hours. One footman, in a letter preserved in family papers, described the torture of standing motionless in tight formal livery, forbidden from coughing, shifting, or responding to muscle cramps. They were furniture that breathed. The mechanical staff, the boiler operators, electricians, and engineers who kept the modern systems running, occupied a separate tier in the hierarchy. They were skilled workers, mostly American-born, earning $40,060 per month. They worked 12-hour shifts maintaining the boilers, water pumps, electrical systems, and telephone network. The head engineer, Robert Anderson, kept detailed logs showing the system's demands: 4 tons of coal per week in winter, 2,000 gallons of water pumped daily to the towers, constant repairs to the primitive electrical system. These men worked in spaces that deliberately contradicted the medieval fantasy above them. The boiler room was industrial, all cast iron and steel, pipes and gauges. The electrical room contained modern switchboards and transformers. The mechanical spaces revealed the truth. This medieval castle was a theatrical set built atop a machine. The estate manager's records reveal the calculated economics of servant management. Wages were kept deliberately low, at or below the regional average. Staff were forbidden from organizing or discussing wages among themselves, an offense that meant immediate dismissal without reference. Young immigrant women with limited English and no other opportunities were preferred because they were unlikely to complain or leave. But the records also reveal resistance. Staff turnover was high, approximately 40% annually. Servants would work a season, save money, and quit for better positions. Some left for factories, where the work was hard, but the hours were shorter and the wages higher. The anonymity that protected employers also gave servants freedom to depart without notice. One story stands out from the archives. In 1907, the kitchen maids organized an informal work stoppage. They simply refused to prepare a massive dinner party for 80 guests unless their wages were raised from $15 to $20 monthly. Helen Gould was hosting a benefit for a Manhattan charity. Canceling was impossible. The head butler, Whitfield, attempted to prepare the meal with the remaining staff. The result was a disaster. Delayed courses, cold food, a humiliating evening for the hosts. Helen capitulated. The maids got their raise, but within 6 months, all 5 had been replaced by new hires at the old wage. The records don't explain what happened to the original maids, but the message was clear. Nobody defied the Goulds. By 1908, Frank was spending almost no time at Castle Gould. Helen remained, desperately maintaining the social performance. The staff continued the grueling work of maintaining a medieval fantasy. But storm clouds were gathering: financial, personal, and social. The castle was about to face its greatest crisis, and the servants who made it function would be the first casualties. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. The year 1909 began with a scandal that would destroy everything Frank J. Gould had built. On January 12th, Helen Kelly Gould filed for divorce in New York Supreme Court. The grounds: adultery. Frank, she alleged, had been conducting an affair with a French actress named Edith Kelly, no relation, while spending months at a time in Paris. The divorce filing made front-page news across America. Not because infidelity among the wealthy was shocking. It wasn't. But because of what it revealed about Frank's true priorities. While Helen had been desperately trying to establish the Goulds in New York society, Frank had abandoned the entire project. The castle, the medieval fantasy, the attempt at American aristocracy, he'd given up. The divorce proceedings exposed the castle's finances in devastating detail. Court documents revealed that Frank had spent $8 million building Castle Gould, then an additional $750,000 over 5 years on operations and improvements, nearly $9 million total, equivalent to $280 million today, on a project he'd occupied for fewer than 200 nights. The mathematics of his failure were now public record. Helen's lawyers argued she was entitled to the castle as part of the settlement. She had, after all, been the one actually living there, maintaining it, attempting to make it serve its intended purpose. Frank's lawyers countered that the castle was his personal property, built before the marriage, and that Helen had merely been a guest in his home. The judge's decision was devastating for both parties. The castle would be sold, with proceeds divided. Neither Frank nor Helen would keep it. The symbol of Gould ambition would pass to other hands within 5 years of its completion. But the divorce was only the first crisis. The second arrived on October 24, 1909, the stock market crash that historians now call the Panic of 1909. Frank, like his father before him, had leveraged his wealth into railroad stocks and real estate speculation. The crash destroyed approximately $3 million of his personal fortune, money he'd counted on to maintain his European lifestyle. Suddenly, Castle Gould wasn't just an emotional failure. It was a financial liability. The annual operating cost of $250,000 continued, regardless of whether anyone lived there. The staff still needed salaries. The coal still needed purchasing. The grounds still required maintenance. The castle was consuming money Frank no longer had in surplus. The servants learned of the crisis through the traditional method: delayed wages. In November 1909, staff salaries were paid 1 week late. In December, 2 weeks late. By January 1910, the estate manager informed the staff that their positions were being eliminated. The castle would be closed indefinitely. 47 servants found themselves unemployed in the middle of winter. Most had no savings beyond a few weeks' wages. The head butler, Thomas Whitfield, wrote a letter preserved in family papers describing the chaos. Servants with families to support were given 3 days' notice. Some had purchased homes in the area, counting on stable employment. The maids who'd won their wage increase 2 years earlier now had no wages at all. Helen Gould moved to a hotel in Manhattan. Frank remained in France, communicating only through lawyers. The castle sat empty, its furnaces cold, its modern systems idle. Within 3 months, pipes burst from freezing. Water damage began destroying the medieval stonework. The carefully installed electrical system, exposed to moisture without climate control, began to corrode. Local newspapers covered the closure with barely concealed satisfaction. The Gould's castle, that monument to excess and ambition, had failed exactly as critics had predicted. One editorial in the Port Washington News noted, "Money can purchase stones from Ireland, but it cannot purchase the history that made those stones meaningful. The Goulds learned what their father never understood. You cannot buy legitimacy." The divorce settlement was finalized in March 1910. Helen received $3 million plus annual support. Frank kept the majority of his remaining fortune, but was required to maintain Castle Gould until it sold. This meant paying a skeleton staff, a caretaker, 1 groundskeeper, and periodic maintenance workers to prevent total deterioration. The castle sat empty for 3 years. Attempts to sell it failed repeatedly. The asking price of $5 million, a $3 million loss from construction costs, attracted no buyers. The castle was too large for most private buyers, too expensive to operate, too eccentric for practical use. It existed in an architectural category of one, an authentic medieval castle in America, built by the most hated family in American history. Frank finally found a buyer in 1913, Daniel Guggenheim, the copper magnate. The sale price, $1.2 million, barely 15% of what Frank had invested. The Guggenheims planned to use it as a summer residence, but they never moved in. Instead, they leased it to various tenants, none of whom stayed more than a season. The castle was too expensive, too impractical, too burdened by its history. Frank J. Gould never returned to America. He married Edith Kelly in France in 1910 and spent the rest of his life in Europe, primarily in the French Riviera. He invested what remained of his fortune in hotels and casinos, becoming moderately successful. He died in France in 1956, age 79, having spent 46 years in self-imposed exile. Helen Kelly Gould remarried in 1914 to a Boston financier. She refused all interview requests about her years at Castle Gould, maintaining absolute silence about the marriage and the castle until her death in 1938. Her private papers, donated to the New York Historical Society, include a single photograph of Castle Gould with a note in her handwriting. "The worst mistake of my life." The servants scattered to other estates, factories, or returned to the immigrant communities from which they'd come. Most left no records. Their names survive only in the estate manager's employment logs: Mary Sullivan, laundress; Giuseppe Ferraro, construction laborer, killed during building; Thomas Whitfield, head butler; anonymous workers who built and maintained a castle that was abandoned almost before it was finished. By 1915, Castle Gould stood empty again, a monument to failure. But its story was far from over. The next chapter would transform it from private shame into public utility, and reveal secrets the Goulds never wanted known. Chapter 7: Resurrection and Reinvention. In 1917, with America entering World War I, Castle Gould found an unlikely savior: the United States Navy. The massive estate, sitting on Long Island's highest point with clear views of Long Island Sound, was strategically valuable. The Navy leased it from the Guggenheims for $1 per year and converted it into a training facility for radio operators. The transformation was dramatic. The Great Hall where the Goulds had entertained became a classroom for Morse code instruction. The medieval bedrooms became barracks. The servants' quarters, finally, housed people who actually mattered to the institution: naval personnel. The castle that Frank built to prove Gould legitimacy now served the nation his father had been accused of betraying through financial manipulation. The Navy installation brought 200 young men to Castle Gould, training them in the new technology of wireless communication. The estate's water towers, built to look like medieval guard towers, were topped with radio antennas. The mechanical systems Frank had hidden so carefully were expanded and modernized. The medieval fantasy became a military facility, function overtaking form. The irony wasn't lost on local observers. The Port Washington News ran an editorial noting that the castle built to elevate one family now serves to defend all families. Perhaps this is its true purpose. The Navy's presence also revealed something the Goulds had hidden. The castle actually worked remarkably well as institutional housing. The 127 rooms, the multiple kitchens, the service corridors, all the infrastructure designed to support Gilded Age entertaining adapted efficiently to military training. The Navy occupation lasted until 1919. When servicemen departed, the castle sat empty again. The Guggenheims, like Frank before them, discovered that Castle Gould was essentially unsellable. Too expensive to operate, too strange to attract buyers, too burdened by history. Then, in 1923, another reinvention. Howard Gould, Frank's older brother, purchased the castle from the Guggenheims. The family was reclaiming its monument, but for an entirely different purpose. Howard planned to convert it into a luxury hotel, the Castle Gould Inn, targeting wealthy New Yorkers seeking weekend escapes. The hotel conversion required extensive renovations. Guest rooms were created by combining the smaller bedrooms. New bathrooms were installed. 12 more added to the existing 23. The Great Hall became a restaurant and bar. The servants' quarters were finally torn out and rebuilt as modern staff housing. The project cost $400,000, money Howard viewed as salvaging the family investment. The Castle Gould Inn opened in June 1924 with advertising that carefully avoided mentioning its builder. Medieval Irish castle on Long Island's Gold Coast, the advertisements proclaimed. Authentic European architecture in America. Frank's name never appeared. The Gould family history was deliberately erased from the marketing. The hotel operated successfully for 3 years. Well-to-do New Yorkers who couldn't afford their own Gold Coast estates could rent the experience for a weekend. The rates were high, $50 per night, equivalent to $850 today, but demand was steady. The castle finally had a sustainable purpose. But success brought new scrutiny. Newspaper features about the hotel began mentioning its history. A 1926 New York Times article detailed Frank J. Gould's original construction, the divorce scandal, the abandonment. The story the family wanted forgotten was resurrected. Howard, embarrassed by the renewed attention, sold the property in 1927 to a development company that planned to demolish the castle and subdivide the land. Demolition seemed inevitable. The development company announced plans to create Castle Estates, a subdivision of luxury homes on the property. The medieval castle would be torn down, its stones sold to collectors, its land divided. The Gould monument would finally be erased completely. Then came the 1929 stock market crash. The development company went bankrupt before demolition began. Castle Gould, abandoned again, became a victim of the Depression. The banks that foreclosed on the development company didn't want it. The property went through 3 ownership changes between 1929 and 1935, each time selling for less than the previous price. During these years, the castle deteriorated rapidly. Windows were broken by vandals. Lead flashing was stolen from the roof. Water infiltration damaged the medieval stones. The mechanical systems, inactive for years, became unsalvageable. The castle that had cost $8 million to build was becoming a ruin. In 1937, Nassau County purchased the property through tax foreclosure for $250,000, approximately 3% of Frank's original investment. County officials debated the castle's fate. Some argued for demolition. The maintenance costs seemed prohibitive. Others saw potential for a public facility, perhaps a library, museum, or government offices. The debate was resolved by World War II. In 1942, the Navy returned, this time purchasing the property outright for $300,000. Castle Gould became part of a larger naval facility, housing administrative offices and providing support for submarine training operations in Long Island Sound. This second military occupation saved the castle's structure. The Navy invested in necessary repairs, waterproofing the roof, replacing damaged stonework, modernizing the mechanical systems. They treated it as a utilitarian building, which paradoxically preserved it better than any attempt at reverent restoration would have. The Navy occupied Castle Gould until 1967, when the facility was decommissioned. The property was declared surplus federal land, its future uncertain once again. But this time, instead of private buyers or developers, a new force would determine the castle's fate: the emerging historic preservation movement. Chapter 8. Hidden Histories Revealed. When Nassau County received Castle Gould from federal surplus in 1971, preservation architects conducting a structural survey made a discovery that would rewrite the castle's history. Behind a sealed wall in the basement, hidden for nearly 70 years, they found a room that didn't appear on any architectural plans. Inside were construction documents, personal papers, and photographs that Frank J. Gould had deliberately concealed. The documents revealed what Frank had spent decades trying to hide: the true human cost of building his medieval fantasy. Detailed payroll records showed systematic wage theft. Workers were charged for tools, housing, and transportation, deductions that sometimes exceeded their wages. Some immigrant laborers had worked for months while actually owing the Gould estate money. The practice, illegal even in 1903, had been carefully hidden from building inspectors and public records. The photographs were more disturbing. They documented the construction site: workers in dangerous conditions, children as young as 12 hauling stones, temporary housing that was essentially a slum. One photograph showed Giuseppe Ferraro, the 19-year-old who died falling from scaffolding, working without safety equipment on a wall 40 feet high. These images contradicted the sanitized narrative of skilled craftsmen carefully reconstructing medieval architecture. Additional documents detailed the servants' lives with cold precision. Medical records showed that tuberculosis ran rampant through the servants' quarters. The crowded attic rooms and poor ventilation created perfect conditions for disease. Between 1904 and 1909, 6 servants died from tuberculosis. Their names were recorded: Anna Schmidt, Margaret O'Brien, Rose Martinelli, Catherine Walsh, John Murphy, Thomas Chen. All were under 30 years old. All were immigrants. None of their deaths were reported to health authorities, as required by law. The papers also revealed Frank's financial manipulations. He'd created shell companies to purchase materials, then sold them to himself at inflated prices, creating artificial expenses that reduced his reported costs. This allowed him to claim the castle cost $8 million, while actually spending closer to $6 million, pocketing the difference while declaring a lower net worth for tax purposes. The Gould family tradition of financial manipulation had continued into the next generation. But perhaps the most significant discovery was a series of letters between Frank and his architect, revealing the deliberate nature of the historical erasure. In a 1908 letter, Frank wrote, "The castle must never be definitively connected to my name. Let it be known as an architectural curiosity, but obscure its origins. I will not be remembered as the fool who built a castle." The architect's response: "The servants will talk." Frank's reply: "Servants always talk. But who records their stories? Who publishes memoirs of maids? In 50 years, no one will remember." He was almost right. The servants' stories had been erased from public memory, but the physical building preserved evidence that memory could not. The 1971 discovery prompted Nassau County to commission a comprehensive historical study. Researchers interviewed surviving servants and their descendants. They found Mary Sullivan, the head laundress, living in a nursing home in Queens at age 94. Her testimony, recorded just months before her death, provided devastating detail about daily life at Castle Gould. "We were invisible," she said. "We woke before the family, slept after they did, worked in spaces they never saw. We made their fantasy possible. They lived in a medieval castle. We lived in medieval conditions." Sullivan's testimony revealed another hidden truth. The servants had built their own community, independent of and invisible to their employers. They'd formed a mutual aid society, pooling small portions of their wages to help each other during illness or unemployment. When Anna Schmidt contracted tuberculosis, the other servants paid her medical expenses. When Giuseppe Ferraro died, they raised money for his family in Italy. The Goulds never knew, never cared. The historical study also uncovered environmental damage Frank's construction had caused. The original excavation had disrupted underground springs that had supplied water to nearby farms. The construction waste, hundreds of tons of soil, broken stones, and construction debris had been dumped in wetlands at the property's edge, destroying habitat and polluting groundwater. The county would spend $2 million in the 1970s remediating environmental damage caused by 1903 construction. Archaeological surveys of the property revealed more secrets. The workers' temporary housing, demolished once construction completed, left archaeological evidence. Excavations found makeshift graves, 3 bodies buried in unmarked graves on the property's edge. The remains were of young men, likely construction workers who died and whose bodies were never claimed or reported. Modern forensic analysis showed one died from tuberculosis, one from blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, one from unknown causes. Their identities remain unknown. These discoveries forced a reassessment of Castle Gould's significance. It wasn't just an architectural curiosity or a symbol of Gilded Age excess. It was a crime scene, evidence of exploitation, a monument built on suffering that had been deliberately hidden. Nassau County faced difficult questions. Should they celebrate the castle as a historic structure or condemn it as a symbol of exploitation? Should they preserve it or let it decay as perhaps it deserved? How do you tell a building's true story when that story contradicts everything its builder intended? The decision was to preserve, but not celebrate. Castle Gould would be maintained as part of Sands Point Preserve, open to the public, but its interpretation would include the hidden histories. Exhibits would feature the servants' names, the workers' conditions, the environmental damage. The building would testify against itself. In 1974, Castle Gould was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation citation, unusually, mentioned both the architectural significance and the social and labor history the structure represents, including evidence of working conditions typical of Gilded Age construction. The castle that Frank J. Gould built to create a legacy had become a very different kind of monument, not to aristocratic pretension, but to the people who built aristocratic pretensions. Not to the Goulds, but to Giuseppe Ferraro, Mary Sullivan, Anna Schmidt, and thousands of unnamed workers who made the Gilded Age golden for those who could afford it. Chapter 9. Legacy and Meaning. Stand at Castle Gould today, and you're standing in a paradox. The building itself is authentic, genuine medieval stones from Ireland, arranged exactly as they stood in County Kilkenny for centuries. But everything it represents is fabricated. The aristocratic lineage it was meant to demonstrate never existed. The social acceptance it was supposed to purchase never arrived. The family legacy it was designed to rehabilitate was instead further tarnished. Castle Gould is American mythology made visible. It's the belief that wealth can purchase history, that money can buy legitimacy, that new money can become old money through architectural appropriation. It's also evidence of that mythology's failure. Frank J. Gould spent the equivalent of $280 million in today's money and achieved nothing he intended. Worse, he created the opposite of what he wanted. Not a symbol of Gould legitimacy, but permanent evidence of Gould excess, exploitation, and ultimate failure. The castle represents the Gilded Age's central contradiction. Unprecedented wealth built on human suffering, beautiful surfaces maintained by invisible labor, aristocratic performance masking ruthless extraction. The medieval stones from Ireland, romantic and ancient, were reassembled by immigrant workers paid starvation wages, living in conditions that killed them, building a fantasy for a family that had accumulated wealth by destroying other families. Preservation efforts have highlighted this contradiction rather than resolving it. Sands Point Preserve, which manages the property today, offers tours that present Castle Gould as both architectural achievement and moral failure. Visitors walk through the Great Hall while hearing about Giuseppe Ferraro falling to his death during construction. They admire the medieval stonework while learning about the tuberculosis outbreak in the servants' quarters. This approach to historical interpretation represents an evolution in how America remembers its Gilded Age. For decades, the era's mansions were presented as architectural marvels, period pieces from a more elegant time. The people who built and maintained them were edited out, their stories considered irrelevant to appreciating the beauty. Castle Gould's interpretation reverses this hierarchy. The building becomes a backdrop for human stories, especially the stories of people history tried to erase. The broader significance extends beyond one castle. The Gold Coast of Long Island once contained over 600 major estates built during the Gilded Age. Most have been demolished. Those that survive face constant pressure from development and maintenance costs. Castle Gould survived partly through luck. Military use during both World Wars prevented demolition when private ownership failed, and partly through its very peculiarity. It was too strange to demolish, too authentically medieval to ignore, too historically significant despite its builders' wishes to let it disappear. Today, Castle Gould serves primarily as an environmental education center. The Sands Point Preserve encompasses 216 acres of natural habitat on Long Island Sound, protecting shoreline, forests, and wetlands. The castle houses administrative offices, classrooms, and exhibit spaces. School groups visit to learn about ecology and, increasingly, about the environmental impact of Gilded Age construction. This use would have horrified Frank J. Gould. His castle, built to demonstrate superiority and exclusion, now serves education and inclusion. The grounds he developed as private paradise are public preserve. The servants' quarters he built to hide workers now house exhibits about workers. His attempt at legacy control failed completely. But the story isn't entirely satisfying. The castle still stands, beautiful despite its blood-stained history. Visitors still take wedding photos on its grounds. The medieval stones still carry romantic associations, even knowing how they arrived. Beauty doesn't disappear just because we learn about ugly origins. This creates uncomfortable questions. Can we appreciate architecture while condemning its builders? Should we? Does preserving these buildings honor or dishonor the people who suffered to create them? Is Castle Gould a memorial to Giuseppe Ferraro and Mary Sullivan? Or is it still, despite everything, a monument to Frank J. Gould? The answer might be that it's both, and that's precisely what makes it valuable. Castle Gould teaches that history isn't simple, that beauty and exploitation coexist, that acknowledging complexity is more honest than choosing comfortable narratives. The castle stands as evidence that you cannot separate an object from its creation, that every beautiful thing has a cost, and that ignoring cost doesn't eliminate it. It just hides who paid. The Gould family, ironically, would probably approve of the current interpretation's central lesson. Money cannot buy respectability. They learned it painfully. The castle teaches it permanently. Frank J. Gould died in France in 1956, having spent 46 years in self-imposed exile from the country where his castle stood. He never returned to see it. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his French hotels and his father's fortune. Castle Gould went unmentioned. Even in death, the erasure he wanted continued. But the castle itself refuses erasure. It stands on Long Island's highest point, visible for miles, an Irish fortress in America, a medieval fantasy built by modern exploitation, a monument to everything its builder wanted to be and everything he actually was. It's preserved not despite its troubling history, but because of it. We keep it standing not to honor the Goulds, but to remember everyone else. That might be the most appropriate legacy. The thing Frank J. Gould built to immortalize himself now immortalizes the people he exploited. The castle meant to erase the Gould family's sins now preserves evidence of those sins forever. Perfect poetic justice, carved in Irish stone. Chapter 10. What remains? On a clear day, Castle Gould is visible from Connecticut across Long Island Sound. The medieval towers rise above the trees, impossible to miss, impossible to mistake for anything else. Tourists photograph it. Local residents give directions using it as a landmark. Children visiting Sands Point Preserve ask why there's a castle in New York. The answer to that question is the documentary you've just witnessed. Castle Gould exists because a man with unlimited wealth and limited imagination thought architecture could rewrite history. It survives because his failure was so spectacular, so expensive, so elaborately documented that it became historically significant despite his attempts at erasure. The servants who built it, who maintained it, who died for it, are finally getting their memorial. Not a separate monument, but the recognition that the castle itself is their story as much as the Goulds. Giuseppe Ferraro, 19 years old, falling from scaffolding. Mary Sullivan, laundress, hands destroyed by lye and hot water. Anna Schmidt, dying of tuberculosis in a crowded attic room. Thomas Chen, John Murphy, Margaret O'Brien, Rose Martinelli, Catherine Walsh. Names recovered from payroll records and death certificates. People who made the fantasy real. Their descendants visit sometimes. The granddaughter of one of the Irish stonemasons who rebuilt the castle came in 2019, bringing photographs of her grandfather working on the stones. The preserve added his photo to their exhibits. History, slowly, is being corrected. Castle Gould teaches us that buildings tell multiple stories simultaneously. The stones say, Ireland, medieval, ancient. The structure says, America, modern, Gilded Age. The archives say, exploitation, suffering, death, all are true. None can be ignored. If you've learned something from this story, if this documentary revealed histories you hadn't known, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell the stories that mansions try to hide. We recover the names that wealth tried to erase. We complicate the narratives that privilege once kept simple. Next time you see a historic mansion, ask yourself, who built this? Who maintained it? Who suffered for it? Who was edited out of its official story? The buildings are still standing. The evidence remains. The truth is waiting to be told. Castle Gould stands on Long Island's Gold Coast, a medieval castle in America, a monument to everyone who built it and everyone who wanted it forgotten. The stones remember, even when people choose not to.